So I told myself I wouldn't be trapped by the podium, and I was going to give you guys a wonderful bi-directional hi. Hi. Welcome to Type in Stereo. I will be your host, Forrest Young. So my name is a noun, and my interest in branding really is that my name is comprised of phonemes, right? These little sound bits, consonants and vowels, which is different if you spell my name with characters, where each of these have intrinsic meaning all the way at the smallest unit level. So if I was to just say F, you'd be like, who the F is he talking about? But this character means wood. What's interesting is that branding oftentimes collapses morphemic meaning into phonemes, meaning that the letter M, based on your sensorial experiences, might be a frightening one or a momentarily satisfying one with a little happy grimace. Exactly what I look like after Chicken McNuggets. So Marshall McLuhan believed that all media is something that extends kind of human ability or capability and can be thought of through kind of four laws, right? The four laws of media. And I would like to think about typography as media. And type in stereo was a cheeky way of alluding to typography in acoustic space, which was McLuhan's term for the space of inseparable smells, sights, and sounds. And that sometimes, probably through the phonetic alphabet, there was a splitting between the visual world of meaning and the smells and the scents. And that's ultimately what branding tries to do in some ways. So here's a simple example. The wheel is an extension of the foot. The car obsolesces the horse-drawn carriage as a de facto mode of transportation to something that becomes nostalgic and quaint, but not as the primary mode of getting around. Media also retrieves and calls things that may have been forgotten. So for instance, a surveillance camera recalls our desire to be protected, right? Living inside of a fortress wall. But ultimately, media can reverse upon itself, and we'll show some examples that I've personally experienced through typography, where it speeds so fast, where there's so much traffic, that all you desire is actually to walk again. So there's a wonderful kind of cyclical nature to media. And a lot of that has come through a lot of the talks about high and low and old and new and kind of where we're going. But ultimately, I think McLuhan addresses a lot of those in the four laws. So I spent a lot of time in the bathroom in graduate school. And ultimately, one of my fascinations growing up in a household of an Atari computer programmer mom was that the pixel, this wonderful little square little nugget, is ultimately an extension of the atom, right? It's our visual atom by which we create visuality in the world around us. It's interesting to think about this basic building block by which we construct meaning, mostly visually through designers, through the screens that we look at. But the pixel is also very limited to a rectilinear framework and also a two-dimensional plane. So my desire in kind of thwarting that was to start to think about a pixel inhabiting different planes, different directions, and different scales. So this led to a very fun project, maybe too much fun, quite possibly maybe too much fun, the Cartoon Network Station rebrand, which ultimately was taking this idea of a pixel and creating a four-dimensional grid by which the pixel extends both horizontally and in depth, and ultimately relates to time. So ultimately we create this grid that exists in four dimensions. It's an exquisite corpse for all types of animation to inhabit, to snap into, and to revolve. And you see a lot of these ideas that started in the bathroom that now are going prime time. And I think it's important here to realize that these fanciful student endeavors you should take very seriously. Don't undermine them. Don't think you're going to graduate and go to the quote-unquote real world. Hold on to that spirit of investigation. It's incredibly important. And ultimately, all this stems from a bathroom excursion. So this idea of liberating the pixel from this grid also was something that I get curious about was, well, can you fold a pixel? Can you take a pixel and actually fold it and actually create new typographic form by something that's supposed to inherently be the basic building block? And this is the idea between creating the next logo for the AICP, where the creases in the folds actually create the letter forms themselves. And ultimately, it lives in motion. It lives in the acoustic space. So the pixel is free to be active, to fold. to dance, as it were, on stage. And I've realized that I have this obsession with the smallest irreducible bits of something still carrying meaning. I simply can't believe that a letter form doesn't have meaning based on experiences you may have, how it's crafted, the types of context in which it calls, the types of scents and the smells of the people that creates images in your mind. And so here, ultimately, and this was a gift from Nina Sassinger of her typeface, C'est la vie, which is open source. And these little guys in the middle are like, hey, let's form choices. Let's come together and form a big word. And I love that idea of the many become one. And also this idea of open source is one I'll revisit as well. So stereotype, interesting that stereotype comes from typography, right? So creating efficiencies in printing by having rather than individual, removable letters, obviously it's a single plate by which you could print something. Ultimately great for printing Bibles, et cetera, novels. But ultimately the term stereotype has come to mean something else, that all typography isn't necessarily, definitely not neutral. It may not be always additive or constructive, it may actually be destructive. So this idea of stereotypography, I think is a very interesting one. A lot of people have talked about. Jonathan's talked about it, I think, Rob Giampietro talked about it, which is like, when you start talking about associations between designers and agency, it's a very embarrassing story, but I'll share it since this is a safe room. The Great Hall, of course, is a safe room. I became a designer because I mistakenly thought that Paul Rand was an African American. This is a true story. So I worked in a library, and somebody showed me a book jacket, and I go, oh wow, he's like an African American culture hero, just like all this like Stokely Carmichael, like side glance, like solving civil rights issues through graphic design for big corporations. Amazing. It's like graphic design is a super progressive field. I gotta investigate it. Where did he teach? He taught at Yale. Must be a great place. And I actually told this story to Jiminy Ha, who published it in White Zinfandel. Paul Rand is an African American cultural hero. The piece is called Paulism. So this is a piece I made just for you guys. This is the first time it's ever aired, called Watermelon Kungfu, right? So you look at it and go, oh man, it's like a watermelon, it's like Bruce Lee. You're like, wait a second, what's going on here? The watermelon recalls things like Jurassic Park and Jumanji and Crocs and all these things that connotate other. If you go to a literature store and you go to the African American section, right? You'll see this typeface, Norline inline. If you look at chop suey, of course, the connotations of communicating otherness. So typography is rarely ever neutral, and sometimes you have to be sensitive to these codes in which it operates in, to be sensitive to. And ultimately, critical typography obsolesces stereotypography. But you were like, how's he gonna do obsolescence? This was a typeface called Kitty Swiss. Taking Mr. Kitty's typeface, Kitty Sans, and ultimately creating what I imagine to be silhouettes into Swiss Army knives, thus refuting a linear sense of progression of modernism and postmodernism and looking at the cyclical and playful nature by which we can imagine all those letter forms as wonderful little Swiss Army silhouettes. This is a typeface created called National Grid, which plays off of LEET, which is 1337, which is the code of hackers and gamers. And it's for the National Grid, and it was a publication focusing on a hacking syndicate. So of course, had to understand the language of hacking. So identity really goes back to like ancient Egypt, right? It's actually related to hieroglyphs, right? Complex pictographic forms. It's no surprise that we're moving back into this pictographic world where people are talking about emoji proliferation. It's actually a return to a pictographic sensibility. This acoustic world lived way before our phonetic alphabet. And metal movable press, of course, originated in South Korea, not in Germany. So it's important to make sure that we have a global perspective for typography. This is trying to retrieve this idea of universality in open source. What if we create an identity that everyone could actually type? So through a colon and 2 posts, you can create the logo for ... So ... creating a face out of the hardware stack, right? Hardware, software, 2 devices connecting over radio, makes a happy, friendly face. To describe insanely complex technology, ... And relating to the language of universality. A lot of brands are global, but they're not universal. So how do things become more universal or localized or sensitive? Also, how can everyone access this logo? Logos are usually lived in gated communities of brand portals, and here it actually lives in GitHub. So actual logo is created in code. through CSS. And so we continued, and we said, what if everything was open source? What if a tape dispenser worked equally for southpaws as they did for right-handed people? Again, humorous, but you start to think of all of these small things that are made for certain types of people. Of course, book design and graphic design has so many connotations, even of a morality and a code of everything moving left to right, right-handed, dexter, sinister, recto and verso. All these implications of what good and evil are baked into a lot of the ways in which we navigate left to right, up and down. What if we had a shuttle pick us up in Las Vegas and take us to a CS convention, and it was self-driving and all about openness? And being part of that vehicle, and this of course is an homage to the Two-Mobile. Some of you are old enough to remember the Two-Mobile. This is my shout out to Chris Pullman. And what if you could live inside of a symbol for openness? Off the grid, of course, with photovoltaics on top. But now I'm going to tell you a story of reversal. Right? This is me living in Central Florida after graduate school and saying, I'm going to change the graphic design landscape of Central Florida. Watch me do it. I kind of gave away the ending, didn't I? The reversal part. And so one of the culture institutions asked if I would help them design a logo for the Orlando Museum of Art. I said, okay, great. I'm going to design the whole thing with a triangle, single triangle, right? Symbol for change, past, present, future, right? The delta. Slides along, creates two other forms, leads to three contours, starts a conversation about color and combinations, whether it's an Albers way of looking at color or Goethe's color pyramid. And then typography then codes those abstract forms as letters that could be performed. And ultimately, since the bathroom seems to be a recurring theme in this talk, what if one shape turned upside down was the women's symbol and the men's symbol, and they were actually the same symbol, and the colors shared the language of pigment, how colors come together for artists to create the whole color wheel? Well, this simply was too much for this museum to handle. And though they embraced it momentarily, they said, hell to the no, and they went back to their old system. But it was a great moment in time, and a bunch of wonderful people who came down to help out. So it'd be impossible for me to come to this wonderful institution and not try to create something uniquely for this institution about this wonderful founder spirit of free in school. And I know this is hot button, and I know that it's not free now, but I love the spirit of everyone believing that that ambition is true. And so here is, relating to another reversal of free school, that I thought was apropos of creating typography just for this talk. So school and free, and maybe school will return back to free one day. Thank you so much.